All right,
we're live. Cool. Hello, everyone. My name is CJ. As Brooks mentioned, I stream myself on YouTube on the YouTube channel Coding Garden CJ. Has anyone seen Coding Garden CJ? Oh my goodness!
yeah!
Wow, that's awesome. What? Oh yeah. I did an episode where I ate spicy hot wings and solved coding problems. I ate progressively spicier hot wings with progressively harder coding problems. But right now, we are about to build the same app that you just saw with vanilla.js. Let's do it. So we're gonna do this in the style of MVC. There's some like design pattern snobs out there that might say this is not MVC, but if you're new to this kind of thing, this will give you an idea of what we mean when we're trying to structure something in the style of model view controller. And so for this app that we're building from scratch, we're not going to use any libraries. We're just going to use what's supported by the browser. We're going to need an app. We'll need a component, potentially multiple components. That component will have a model, a view, and a controller. We'll need some sort of router to be able to swap between components, and we will need some sort of API client. Let's write some code. So, oh, what's happening? Yeah. So just like the others, I'm starting off, I have my styles here. I have the same layout that you've seen twice now. And in this folder, I'm going to use a tool called Light Server, which is an auto-refreshing dev server. There we go! Yeah. Okay. So we have our basic app. Let's start off. So let's do this. So I'm gonna go off script. I've never done this before, but yeah. I'm gonna attempt to use ES 2015 import-export syntax in the browser. Oh yeah. Okay, yeah. So let's start here. So we want we're gonna pull in a script. Let's call this index.js. This is gonna be our entry point, and we're gonna say type equals module. Yeah. Yeah, and so now, this should work, I don't know. So we're gonna create an index.js, and so I'm gonna kind of do, I guess you call it like consume first development. Like we're gonna write dream code, like we're gonna write code like we wish this thing actually exists, and then we'll go make that thing exist. So
9/11, right?
What? So what I wish existed was a class called app, because I want to create an app here. This is what we're doing, right? So I want that to exist. And on this app, I want to pass it a selector, like ID app, because I want this app to live on ID app. Great. So let's make this work. So again, we're going off script. We're going to import app from lib/app.js. I don't know. Is this going to work? Let's try it. So we need a folder. We're going to call it lib. We're going to create a file called app.js. And we need to export a class, right? So we imported app, and then we tried to create an instance of it, so we need app.js to export a class. So we're going to create a class called app. And right now it's just going to have a constructor. It takes in that selector, which we passed in, and then we're going to create an instance property. So we'll say like this.app element equals document.query selector, and then we'll pass in that selector. Cool. Let's just log hello world to see if this actually works. If it doesn't, we're gonna backtrack though. But this I think it should work, right? So index.html brings in index.js type module that imports app. Yeah, this is great. Well, let's see it happen. Oh, I didn't export it. It's working though. Yeah. So check it. The requested module does not provide an exported named default. So yeah, we just gotta export default app. Ooh, this is great. Okay, so export default app.
Yeah!
We're smooth sailing here. This is great. You know what this means? This means index.js is literally the only thing I need to import, and everything else is just gonna work. Okay. So let's think about what we want to do here. So we want app to be able to add components to it, right? So we'll say app.add component. And we're gonna give it an object. And components have names, so let's call this dogs. And we're gonna do this in style of MVC, model view controller. So if you think about the model, in Vue, it's called state in Vuex, but it's called data. In React, it's called state, but we're just gonna call it the model, similar thing. And our model is an array of dogs. Very simple, right? It's also going to have a view. This is just going to be a function that takes in the model and returns an HTML string that uses the model inside of it. So let's just have like an h2. We'll say there are model.dogs.length dogs, right? So it should say there are 0 dogs because the array is empty. Cool. Now let's make this work. Before we try to create a router or anything, let's try to make it show up on the page. So what if I did app.showComponent and passed in dogs, right? So add the component, show it, we should see there are 0 dogs on the page, right? So the first thing we need is add component. So in our app class, we need a function called add component. This takes in component. I'm running on 4 hours of sleep. Okay, right, okay. Add component takes in a component. And then the app needs to keep track of all of its components. So we're going to do this.components. It's just going to be an object where the keys are the names of the components and the values are the components themselves. So we'll say this.components at component.name equals component. Cool. So we got that working. That's add component. And now we want to be able to show a component. So what we'll do in show component, that takes in the name of a component, right? And let's also create an instance property that is current component. So I'll say, when you show a component, this.current component equals this.components at that given name. So we have current component. And now let's create a function that's called update view, right? So we set the component, we call update view, and update view will actually change the HTML inside of app element, right? So we have update view, and we'll do some checking. So we'll say if this.current component is a thing, then we'll say this.app element.inner HTML equals this.current component .view. And remember, it's a function that returns an HTML string, but we do need to pass in the model, so we'll pass in this.currentComponent.model. Cool. And so if we did everything right, we should see there are cannot set property inner HTML of null. Let's see what's happening. This.app element document.query selector. Oh. There is no element on the page with ID app. We need to fix that. So we'll set main, and we'll give it an ID of app. Is this going to work?
Yes.
Yes? Yes! Yes! Okay. So there are 0 dogs. Great. This is awesome. Okay, so now, we probably need some. I guess we'll hook up routing. Right, let's get a router working. So I don't want to have to manually call show component. I want to be able to create a router, add some routes, and then based on the URL, show that given component. So we'll say, what will we say? Let's just create a router. So new file router.js. This is going to be a class as well, class router. Let's not forget to export it. Export default router. It'll have a constructor. This constructor will take in an app, so that way it can call app.showComponent, right? So if we give it access to the app, when it sees the URL changing, it can show the component. So we'll say this.app equals app. Cool. And now let's create an instance of the router. So in here, we need to import that router. Look at us importing in the browser. This is great. Router.js, and then we need to create an instance of a router. So I'll say router equals new router. We'll pass in the instance of the app. Should be good there. Now we want to be able to add routes, right? So I want to say router.add route, and we'll give it the name of a component. So we want a route for the dogs component, and then we need to give it a path. So I am just going to be using the hash paths. So we'll do /hash/dogs, like that. So when the path is equal to that, show the dogs component. We will turn this into a regular expression though, because we want to match against all the various routes. So we'll say it must begin with that and it must end with that. So that's a regular expression. Cool. So now we need add route in our router. So we'll say add route. We took in the name and path. And we should probably keep track of all the routes that we have. So we'll say this.routes equals an array. And then when you add a route, we'll just push a route into that array. So this.routes.push will push an object that has that name and path. Cool. Doing good so far. But now we need to tap into when that URL changes. And we can do that in the browser with the event. So we're going to do window.add event listener hash change. So whenever the hash in the URL changes, this will call a function. So we'll say this dot hash change. And so we need a function hash change. Not that, hash change. When this function gets called, let's just log window.location.hash. So we should see anytime the hash changes, the hash should be logged to the console. And if we look at index.html, this is our header is already linking to /dogs. So we should be able to test it out. So if I click here, yes. So when the route changes, we see the URL. So now we need to find that route, right? So we have the regular expression. We need to search through it, match it against it, and if we find something, show that component. So let's do that. So inside of here, let's say route equals this dot routes dot find. We're going to get each individual route. Let's write it on multiple lines so it's a little bit legible. So we're going to say, well, actually, let's grab the hash from the location. So hash equals window.location. And then we'll say hash.match. That's a thing, right? Strings can match against a regular expression. I think it's a thing. And then we'll create a new regular expression with route.path. So we want to find the route where the hash matches that regular expression. And if it matches, we should get that route. Yeah? Yeah, okay. So nothing happens because the URL has to actually change, but one thing we can do is we can tap into DOM content loaded. So the moment the DOM is ready, let's go ahead and call hash change to do something based on the current URL. So we can basically do the same thing, but we'll just do it for DOM content loaded. So now when the page loads, it'll attempt to load a component. Cannot read property find of undefined. I will give a sticker to anyone who can tell me what is wrong with my code. You have 20 seconds.
What's the error? I missed the error.
There, cannot read property find of undefined. Marlena?
Is it a matter of what's running first? Is routes not defined by the time
No,
content
it definitely is. So we're defining routes here, and then we're listening for it.
Is it a binding problem?
It's a binding problem! So because DOM content loaded executes the hash change function in the context of the window. So this gets called and it's trying to say like window.routes. That doesn't exist. So we need to pre-bind the function so that when either of those functions are called, we have the right this. So we'll say this.hashChange equals this.hashChange bind this. So now when it gets called, it will know what this.routes are. Yes. Yeah. That was, you guys weren't very excited about that. And I'm okay. I'm not trying to be condescending. I'm teaching, right? Hopefully that's how it's coming across. Okay. Cool. So we found the route. Now we need to show it. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna say if we found that route, we will say this.app.show component. This is my break timer. Let's take a stretch. Reach into the sky. Okay, so if you remember where we are, we just found the route. Now we want to show the component based on that route. So we're going to say show component, and we'll pass in route.name, and that should do it. Yeah, there we go. So when the page loads, it automatically shows the route. Awesome. So now let's get some API stuff going, right? So basically, instead of just this plain H2, we want to actually call the API, get the dogs, all that good stuff. So let's create a file called api.js. I'm not going to do this as a class. I'm just going to export an object with some functions on it, mainly because it doesn't have any internal state. So I want to do something like get dogs. This is an async function that does a fetch. So we'll say response, await fetch on some URL, and then we'll just return response.json. And I have that URL right here. Like that. Cool. So we have our API with get dogs. Now in here, this is where the controller comes into play, because the controller is the thing that's going to reach out to the API, it's going to get the data, then once it has the data, it'll update the model, and then the view will update. So this thing needs a controller, which takes in the model so that it can modify it. And here is where we will call the API. So let's import, like this is great, importing with like no build tools, right? This is running directly in the browser. So let's import API from lib/API. And then in our controller, we can make this an async function, so that way we can call it. So we can say const dogs equals await api.getDogs. Cool. And then for now, we'll just log the dogs to make sure that we're getting them. And now we actually need to call that controller function. So that's going to be the job of the app. So when the app shows a component, call the controller function so that it can start doing its business. So in app.js, we'll say show component, we'll call update view, and let's do a checker. So we'll say if this .current component is a thing. I'm trying to think, do I want to update the view before or after I call the controller? I'll say before, it's fine. So if this .current component is a thing, then we'll say this .current component .controller. We're going to invoke it, and we're going to pass in its model. Yeah, so anytime we show a component, call the controller. So when we show the dogs component, that should call the controller, which will make the API request. 404 not found. Oh, I think you have to put .js. That's good to know. There it is. Yeah. Cool. So the component loads. We call the controller. It calls the API. We log it to the console. But now instead of just logging, we want to update the model, right? So we'll just say model.dogs equals dogs. But that won't actually update the view, right? Because it doesn't know that it changed. But if we say app.update view right here, should change. There are 10 dogs. But we don't want to have to call update view all the time. We want things to be magic, right? We just set properties, the view automatically updates. So for that, we're going to use proxies. So in our app, whenever we add a component, we're essentially going to tap into any time a property is set on the model. So anytime we set a property, we can automatically call update view. So when you add a component, I'm going to say component.model equals this.proxify component model. And then proxify is going to be a function that turns it into a proxy. So proxies are new in ES, well, not new, I mean, ES 2015, they came out. But they're super cool, and I'll show you how they work. So we're going to pass in the model, and then we want to return a new proxy. Proxy first gets a target, so what are we going to watch for changes? And you cannot, it's not only for watching for changes, you can also detect any time a property is retrieved or intercept function calls. You basically are in control of what's happening to this target. Our target in this case is the model, and then we can pass it a set of handlers. There are many different handlers. The one that we care about is set. So whenever a property is set on the model, we want to call this function. And then here we will get access to the target itself, the name of the property that's changing, and then the value that it's being set to. And I'm going to make this an arrow function so we don't run into binding issues like we did earlier. But essentially, this function gets called every time we try to set a property. But poor man's Redux logging tools, like anytime we change a property, we can log it to the console. So we'll say changing property from, and the current value will be target at value, target at property, changing from that to that new value, right? This thing should return true anytime it updates the value, and then you actually need to update the value. So we actually need to say target at property equals value. Cool. So we should see in the console, changing dogs from empty array to an array of 10 items. Yeah, sick. So now, all we gotta do is update the view, right? So we'll say this.update view, and yes, sweet. Yeah, this is pretty much the app. I mean, so now we just gotta add the templates and stuff, but we're home free from here. So that's the same template that you've seen multiple times, right? We're just gonna turn this into a template string, and then pass in the dog, and it'll render it out. So in our index, I mean, technically, I could split this into multiple files. This is beautiful. Like, one day, we will not need build tools, right? We can just write the app.
Fuck, we're packed!
So let's create a function called template, dog template. This takes in the dog, and it returns a template string that is all of this stuff. It's going to be a link that links to dog/ID. It has the name, the URL, the name, the description. Cool. And now in our dogs component, we essentially just want to iterate over dogs and create a bunch of those. So we'll have a list. It'll have a class of dogs. And then we need a list item with the dog template for any given dog. But essentially, this piece right here, we need to repeat for every single dog in the dogs array. So for that, we'll just use a map. So inside of this template string, we'll say model.dogs.map. And we want each individual dog. From that, we are going to create a template string that is a list item that puts the dog template inside of the list item, and then this whole array, we just want to join it together on the empty string. Cool. You guys seem excited. That's a good thing. Okay, so we're basically the code writes itself, right? So now, when we click on a dog, we want to show that individual dog. We can see the URL is updating, but there isn't a component registered for the single dog route. So let's do that. So we need another route. Well, actually, let's create the dog component, which is actually going to be very similar, right? So let's just copy paste this. It's a dog. It's not an array. It's an object. Its template is literally just the dog template. So we'll just do that, model.dog. And then it needs to call a function.
43 dogs. In your model.
43.
Thank you.
43.
You guys are looking out. Cool. So yeah, same idea, but now it's just a single item. So name is dog. It has a dog. Ultimately, the view is just one single dog template with that dog. We need to call get dog. We need to pass it an ID. We don't have those params just yet, so let's default it to 0. And then we'll say model.dog equals dog. Now we need a get dog function. So again, it's very similar. Get dog, pass in the ID. And we could turn this into a template string. We could concatenate it. Let's turn it into a template string. Template/ID. And that should give us one dog. Cool. Last thing we need is the actual route, which will show that one dog. So we're going to add a route for dog. This gets a little more complicated. So this is going to be / and then we want to match any number 0 through 9 and one or more occurrences of that. So this is a regular expression that matches the ID on the end of the URL. And this should work. Yeah, look at that, we got a dog. So the thing that's missing right now though is we've hard coded the ID 0, right? So any dog we click on, we're just going to get Iago, which is not a bad thing, but we do want our app to actually work. Let's get some params going. So in the router, once we've found a matched route, we can essentially execute that regular expression against the hash to pluck out a value. So because I wrote this regular expression like this, the parentheses is a matching value, so it's going to give me that number. So let's do that. So we'll say params equals hash.exec. Is that a thing?
That's a thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
I get the two confused. When do I use match or when do I use exec? But I think that this will do it. So execute this regular expression with the found route path on the hash. And that should
gives you the matches. I think match just tells you true or false.
Okay, good call. So if we log that, we should get the matches. So hash.exec is not a function. Maybe I think I need to reverse this. Execute it on the hash.
Yes.
There we go. So this is what we get back. It's kind of ugly, but it does, as you can see, it plucks off the number 3, and so we can use that. So essentially, we'll just say this dot params equals params. So right now we're inside of the router, so we put the params on the router, and then we can use those params right here. So we'll just say router dot params at 1, and we get dog with ID 3. Yeah. So yeah, it works. Yoda.
Yeah!
We did it. This is it. I'm excited about this import-export syntax. That is fantastic. Yeah, and I don't know if you read the Meetup description. I did say I was going to use web components, but like I coded it with that, and it seemed more cumbersome than coding it this way. I don't know. This was fun. I think I have some closing words. I had a bunch of GIFs. Those were cool. Oh yeah. So a review. What just happened here? We created an app, right? This is our whole application. We had 2 different components. We had the dog component and the dogs component. They both had a model, a view, and a controller. I guess just to take a step back, like this controller, if you think about it in React, this is kind of like component did mount. It's like a lifecycle hook, right? And the view is kind of like our render function. It returns some HTML based on the model. Model is like state. Yeah, I mean, you can call it those things, you can call them other things, but yeah. We made a router. The key thing about the router was tapping into that hash change. So when the URL changes, we could do something based on that. And we had some simple API calls. The app it might have had more functions than that, but add component, show component, update view. Our component, we saw that. Yes. In conclusion, should you do this in production?
Yes.
No. So this is fun, and frameworks exist for a reason. So a lot of coding hours and expertise go into making like really full-fledged things that you can build production applications with. And I didn't have any tests. Test frameworks are tested like crazy. They come built in with tests. You have all kinds of community. So frameworks exist for a reason. You shouldn't build all apps this way. But should you do this for fun? And I say yes, absolutely. Ultimately, I always try to answer this question. Like anytime you import a module or you do npm install, try to think to yourself, like, how would you write that thing? Like, right, you're calling a function. Somebody had to write that code, right? So that's how I often like to think. And typically, like, I just go source diving. Like, who here has looked at the React source code? There should be more hands. Who has looked at the Vue source code? Right? It's not a scary thing. It's just JavaScript. So I think that's why I did this, is to inspire you to build stuff. There is this repo. This is actually from when I did the same app 2 years ago, but without the import export. So I'll definitely upload that. Thank you very much.